And we're live. Okay, everyone. ShannonMac and Jinx had something to do at IMVU that meant that they weren't going to be able to do today. So it's just a preview of what, well, this is just a preview of what potentially is going to be done. I'm still not sure exactly what they want or what they want ShannonMac to learn, but it involves text. So I thought we'd go over that as a preview for what may be being done. No, that's fine. So we've just got a couple of people in chat. That's Liana and Frenzy Wicked. Yes, something with heart. Yes, I'm not quite sure what it is that they want, but it will be if it involves text, it will be first for ShannonMac, because I don't think he's used that feature. I don't use the feature much myself either. So this will just be an overview of how you can use text to create meshes. So it's probably a good idea to go over this today briefly, because we probably won't be able to go over it when Shannon is learning how to use the text feature. No, Liana, same here. I don't use the text feature much at all, but it's actually quite straightforward to use. The only issue really is I've got a sample already set up. Don't worry about this. We'll go over actually how you do this in a bit. But the main concerns the main concern is the resolution of the mesh. So when you're using text, you have to be careful about how dense the mesh or the resulting mesh is going to be, because if you want to keep as much of this clean shape as possible, it's going to mean that when the text is eventually converted into a usable mesh that can be exported for IMVU, it's going to be relatively dense. I have a... what did I do? Is it Alt-H? So this is the one below. Let me switch. Is the converted mesh. Well, it's a version of the text above, but this bottom one that's selected, that's actually text. Or it was text. It's converted. It's converted from being a vector, I guess, which is what text is, to a mesh. And this has actually had its resolution already lowered. Yeah, it is messy, Liana. That's one of the other things that you have to think about when you convert the text, because particularly with the, depending on the font that you use and the shape of the letters, yes, it's going to be quite messy. So it will use a lot of surface structure, so that's polygons. But the density is going to be the thing that is that will be the challenging part, that when you use text, you want to keep the shape, obviously, but you want to do it in a way that you're not using a huge amount of polygons. Yeah, no, yeah, you can try doing that. Frenzy mentioned that, she said jokingly that we have to fix the orientation of the lines. Yes, you can try doing that. But as you can see, the orientation is dependent on the shape. But so that's the mesh density, which is the one consideration. But the next one is how you unwrap, UV map the text. So if I switch to UV editing, right, so we've got the 3D view on the right and the UV image editor on the left, and it's set up with, or the object is set up with a material that has a 128 by 512. Yep, it does. Unwrapping can be a pain depending again on the font that you use and the shape of the letters. But so if I switch to edit mode, that's the UV. Now the simplest way of dealing with the UV or the UVs is to do a box. Is to do a where is it? A cube projection, which basically unwraps the object like a box. So it treats the entire object like a box rather than the individual shapes of the letters, which results in, well, in this instance, because these aren't, is it cursive joined up letters, you end up with a lot of individual shapes. And obviously you're getting the front. Let me focus on this question mark. So you get the front and the back. Let me see if I can focus on that actually. So select that. Focus on that. So if I select the question mark, just to make this easier to see. Right, so we've got the question mark focused on. And as you can see, what it's done using a box unwrap or cubic unwrap is that it's unwrapped each of the elements relative to a cubic projection. So if we so that's front, that's right, and that's top, and then bottom is, or would be, that. So it's unwrapping the object relative to those projections. Now this might mean that you end up with some distortions or some inconvenient breaks in the UV, which, as we can see at the period, that's broken that up into several sections. So where's that top bit gone? That bit, there it is. So what you might ordinarily do with this is mark seams so that you split the two ends apart, and then mark a seam along the width so that you can split the UV and lay it out flat. But if you do cubic projections, it'll break it relative to the front, top, bottom, right perspectives. So that is something to be aware of when you're unwrapping objects. Obviously, using a cubic projection or one of the projections is going to be a lot easier and quicker than unwrapping each of the individual letters, which, although might be more efficient and tidier, is going to be hugely time consuming. Yes, the lines are your friends. Frenzy, yep. Very true. So those are the two main concerns that you will have working with text, is the density, mesh density, of the converted text and the UV maps. How you unwrap what is essentially quite a complex shape. So, with that in mind, I'll go over the process of using text. So, create a new file, a new scene. So, file, new, clear all that out of the way. Nope, we didn't import text. So what we'll do now is just go over the process, Liana, of using text. So first thing you want to do really is we don't need any of the objects that are in the scene by default. So you can either delete them, which is the X key or the delete key, or you can just move them to an unused layer. So press the M key, M for Marty. Layers pop-up will appear, and just move them out of the way. So this will give us a blank scene with nothing in it. Next, add text. And it always tends to orient itself flat on the ground plane. So to see it, press the numpad 5 and then top view, which is numpad 7, or view, and then just use your views to switch the orientation. A modifier, a frenzy, a modifier will be used, but that'll come in handy later. So we want to focus on that text. So select, no, is it select or object? Object. Is it snap? No, it's not snap. This is the problem with using shortcut keys. You get so used to using shortcut keys you can't remember where the menu items are. Oh, there it is. View selected. So, this is the bit that confuses most people. To actually add or edit the text that's appearing on screen, you have to be in edit mode. And you'll get the traditional, well, it's this lozenge, that's the cursor. And you can use the backspace to delete and then type a word. And that's all you can do in edit mode, is just type. You've got the same sort of controls. Valentine's. Yeah, so you've got the same sort of control over what you type. But to actually do something to this, you have to be in object mode. So you place the text, which we can't do in edit mode, but you place the text. Once it's on screen, you go into edit mode, type whatever it is that you want to type, and then exit edit mode. So this creates an object, so we've now got a text object. Yeah, so double check to make sure that Blender doesn't have a spell checker now, so quite right. So you'll have to double check. So double check that that's spelt correctly. Valentine. Is it VALENTINE''S? Hearts. So once you've got your text, to modify it, let's switch back into perspective so that we can actually see this. You want to do, with the text selected, let me just show the cube. Yes, the typo fairies Liana could wreak havoc. So this is one of the things about Blender in terms of its context sensitivity. So when you have an object, an ordinary object selected, the buttons display one set, but when you have text selected, I think it's the object data button, which is this one, the one with the triangle, that changes to an F, indicating fonts. So when you're editing fonts or doing something to fonts, you want to click on Object Data Properties, which is the F. And this opens this panel. So let me just hide that cube. This opens the panel where the fonts can be changed and modified. Now to make this a 3D object is relatively straightforward. All you need to do is alter the extrude value. You can either left click drag or actually type a value. So let's just do 0.2. And that creates a 3D object. Now, to change the font, this is where it gets a bit tricky, because you need to have access to your what will be, if you're using Windows, it'll be a hidden folder on your system where the fonts are hidden. And we can change the fonts, or this is the default Blender font. But to change it, in Object Data Properties, click on the folder icon and it'll default to your Windows directory, or it should default there. If not, you have to browse to and select Windows, wherever your operating system is installed, and then your Windows folder, and then in there is fonts. Where's fonts gone? There it is, fonts. You just click that and you can change the display to show the actual fonts that are available by clicking the display buttons at the top there. And that will show a preview of the fonts that you've got available. So let's try that one. So select it, left click, and then open font. And you can see it instantly changes the text. Yes, it's it does do that, doesn't it? A quick brown fox. Yeah, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. Yeah, sample text. So one thing to consider actually with your fonts is that they'll need to be Well, these are all TrueType fonts, which is basically Windows based, so I don't know. Yeah, it looks like it'll only accept TrueType fonts as opposed to Adobe, I think it is the other. Yeah, so that's something to keep in mind, is that you will probably only be able to use TrueType fonts. So cancel that. But once you've loaded it, it'll instantly change, and you've got the same editing capabilities as you have with any other font. So that's your basic object. And then to convert this into a 3D mesh, what we do is right click select, is it object menu, yeah, and convert to mesh. And then in the panel that appears bottom left, we want to keep the original. You don't have to, but this is just useful for reference. And it'll keep the original. And if we just move that to one side, so which is the original? Oh, so the mesh has been created. That's the one that's actually selected. Oh, hey, Notorious. So we've now got two versions. One is the original, which is the fonts, and the other is a mesh, which if we now switch to edit mode, is editable as an actual mesh. But, as you can see we were talking about earlier, the density is it's pretty heavy actually, so that is something that you have to watch out for. But this is where the modifier comes in, Frenzy, because what you can do, so let's enable wireframe so that we can see what we're working with, and then in the modifier stack make sure your mesh version is selected, modifier stack, add modifier, and we want decimate. Now if you watch the density of the, I don't know how well this will come through on the video, so let me see if I can move in a bit closer. Right, so if you watch the density of the vertical lines, they should change. So we want ratio, left click drag, or you can type a value. And you can see how the density of the mesh is reduced quite significantly depending on the value that you use. Let's just type 0.5. And that's reduced the density of the mesh, but it keeps the shape of the letters. Well, as best as it can. But you do get some gaps appearing. So you'll have to apply this to make this real. Yeah, so as Liana was saying, icky polygons, yes. So you have to make sure that you fix these errors. So edit mode and select your edges and then just fill the gaps. This is actually going to be quite tricky. So this is something that you have to keep aware of. Because of the way that the mesh was actually constructed, if you were making this manually, there would be an edge from this edge to this bottom edge. But because of the reduction and the way that the letter is constructed or auto-constructed, we've got an alignment issue. So we're going to have to just select the two sides of the face that's missing, and then we can fill that gap with the F key, and it'll fill the gap, and then we just need to go around the mesh to make sure that that's there was another one. Where was the other one? There it is. So select those two edges and fill the gap. It's done the same on the underside, so do that. Fix that. F. So the other one will also have a gap, and it does. So select, fill the gap. Now because this is a mesh, you can work with it the same way that you would normally do with any other sort of mesh. So assign a material. Give it a color if you want. Add a texture. And then create an image that you want to UV map that with. So text. 128 by 512. Select the grid and then OK. Oh yes, there is, isn't there? So Frenzy was just pointing out that there is another hole in the T. So there's one there. Fill that gap. There's one there. Whoops. Fill that, so there'll be one on the underside as well. So focus on that selection, which is the numpad key, or view selected, and rotate around. So fill that one with the F key. Where's the other one? And that one. And you'll note adding or filling that gap, because there's already a material assigned to the object, it will auto assign the material, or the diffuse color appears on those new faces. So is that everything? Double check. Yep, looks like it. So when you are setting up your material, depending on how you want your texture to appear on this, so what we've just done, switch to UV image editor, although you can't see it yet. Where is it? There it is. Oh, need to change the orientation, so we want it to be 512 wide by 128 high. So we've got a lozenge. Yeah, all the, as Frenzy and Liana said, all the T's had spaces or gaps in them because of the way that this element, if it's selectable, element that goes across the main body of the letter is constructed. So how you unwrap this depends on what you want your texture to do. So if, for example, you had an image that changed color, so let's say it was blue on one side and green on the other. So if that were mapped to the text, you would have green on one side, blue on the other. Or if you want the object to be mapped with a simple single solid color, you could change the size of the image. I mean, you could literally make that this will be absolutely tiny, a 2 by 2. That would be a PNG, a single colored PNG, which would mean that how you unwrap the text doesn't really matter. So you can, in that instance, just select everything. Whoops. Let me go into switch into texture mode, which is that one. So texture mode, if we just unwrap this and just use reset, and hopefully it won't crash. It looks like it might have crashed Blender. You lozenges? Is that what you meant, Frenzy? I think this has crashed Blender. So that's something to be aware of. When you are editing text or using text, you have to be aware that you might crash Blender. And I think that has. Because it's not doing anything. Oh no, there we go. So if we now select and apply text, you can see that it's just changed color to grey at the moment because we've only got a simple grey texture. But if that's all you want in terms of the appearance of the letters, then you can just use a simple UV map that resets the UVs, because you're not doing anything specific with the appearance of the object. But to change that, I mean, you could, in theory, apply a material to each letter, a different material to each letter. So let's just select that. And each letter would have its own texture properties, which you could then assign an individual, even though it's a 2 by 2 pixel image. So if overall you had one that was green, you could select individual letters and UV map another image that was red to those letters, so that you can get some difference, but you don't necessarily have to do anything complicated with the UVs. But to do it properly, so let's change this back. So we want that 512 by 256, no, 128. So to UV map properly, select everything in edit mode, and we want mesh, UV unwrap, and for this, cubic projection. And it does what was explained previously, it breaks everything down into its projection based elements. So I don't know if you can see that. I'm moving a bit closer. So if I select this group down at the bottom, you can see that it moves some elements of the UV on the mesh, but not all of them. And the same for this group, and again for this group. So depending on how you want the what the image is supposed to do, so if we had a transition or a blend, so blue one side, green the other, you would then just select the UVs that you want to texture. Best way to do this, yeah, so just place it in the middle, press the S key and resize, and you'll resize the UVs, and then just repeat for the other sections depending on how you want the image to be mapped across the surfaces that you've just unwrapped. Of course, because of the random nature of the way that it's unwrapping everything, if you do have a blended or transitional texture, due to the way it unwraps, you're not necessarily going to have full control over how the texture appears per selected elements. So they will not always be oriented the same way or flipped the same way. So some of these sections could be upside down and back to front. So that is another thing that you have to be aware of when you're working with text. But with a bit of thinking, a bit of fiddling, you can create text-based mesh objects. So that's the mesh. That's the original text. And that's converted to a mesh that you can edit. And of course then, once you've got your text, you can do whatever you want with it for IMVU. So you would then have to scale that up relative to the furniture sample file or avatar accessory file, depending on what it is that you want this to do. So hopefully that, what we've covered in basically 40 odd minutes, that hopefully is what ShannonMac is going to be doing. Something along those lines of mucking about with text. The font tools. So Friends is asking about the font tools. So let's just move this out of the way. Move that to another layer. So press the M key, M for Marty, and just move that to another layer. So we've now got the original text object that we created. So actually, so remember, the properties buttons change depending on the type of object you've got selected. So with a text, an actual text object, you'll get the F button. With a mesh selected, you don't get that. You get this triangle. It's the same set of data, but because the object type is different, the actual properties that appear differ. So make sure you've got your selected text left click the F button, and then you get all the properties. For the most part, you only need to use extrude, but the main thing that you probably want to work with is making sure your fonts are set. So you've got different types of fonts. You've got regular, bold, italic, and bold and italic. You can change some of these properties to a degree. I think sheer, yeah, so sheer changes the italic or the orientation of the text. So if you add text in here that doesn't have an italic version or a bold version, you can alter the text by changing the sheer setting. Yes, there are. So Frenzy's asked about alignments. So you've got your italic or normal setting that you can offset. You can change the size, but these are not, the size isn't related to point. You know, so if you type text and change the font size to 12 point or 18 point like you would do in Word, there are other options, but I'm not sure if these work unless the font has. So if this was an underlined font, because these don't generally do anything. So I think you have to have a font loaded that actually provides underline with the font. That's the only disadvantage with the way that this works, is that you can't just, as you would do with a word processor, you would select your text and just do Control B to make it bold or Control I to make it italic. It doesn't work the same way. Well, let's try that. Oops. Oh yes, you do. You're quite right. You have to be in edit mode. But it overrides. It overrides the default font that you're using. Oops. So that's, you have to make sure that the mouse is over the 3D view, otherwise it'll not do anything. Yeah, so depending on the settings that you've used here, it'll override the font that you've loaded. So that's something to be aware of. No. Right, so what it's doing, I can tell you what it's doing, Frenzy. It's using the font that's loaded into the bold setting, and it'll do the same thing for italic and bold. So if you want to enable these, what it's essentially doing is overriding, well, it's not overriding, it's using the font that's listed in the fonts list. So that's why it's listing the, that's why it's using the default font rather than the one that we actually want. Let's see. Yeah, so yeah, so I can understand that, pointing at the screen. Look there. So that's one thing that you'll have to do, is if you want to change the weight and what's the other word, whether the font is italic or not, you have to load a font that actually is bold italic or bold and italic. So if you want those kinds of letters in whatever it is that you're typing, you have to make sure that the font that you're using has that option. So alignment. So back into edit mode, into object mode. You can align the text to a degree. Let me just top view. And it aligns itself relative to the object center, which is that origin point. So we do have different types of alignment that we can use. Change the spacing. Change the map. You can change the spacing between words, although we won't necessarily see this in this. So if I go back into edit mode, space, space. So this should change the spacing. Yep. So we've got spacing between words, spacing between letters, and line. So switch back to that. And this should change the distance between the lines. Yeah. So we do have some options that we can use to change the position of the fonts, which makes it initially easier before we then convert this to mesh, which is a bit more difficult to edit depending on the font that you've selected. Offset. So we can offset the mesh relative to the origin point. So that's the left, right, and up and down. And that's pretty much it, really. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So it's you could consider it to be, it's not quite Notepad and it's not quite Word. It's probably more closely akin to an RTF editor. So it's WordPad, not Notepad, in terms of the complexity or the editing ability that you've got with the fonts. So you have some control over them, but not a whole lot, because it's not a word processor, obviously. A text box, Frenzy, you mean the thing at the bottom? I think what that does, the equivalent of that, we can't see it. So, oh, there it is. Okay. Right. I guess that's the, well, essentially that's the obviously the equivalent of a text box in a word processor or design application. So if you were copy pasting a block of text into a text box, it's going to fit or wrap relative to the area that you've defined. But the box isn't an object, it's just a an area definer. Can't think of the right words. It just delineates an area into which text can be placed. I don't think it's an actual thing, because when you're in object mode, which is what's needed to convert the text, there's nothing there. But that might be useful, obviously, for Justify, because you're defining an area of text to which the text itself is locked. Yes, so as Leona's asking, adding poses would be similar to other furniture. So yes, once you've got your object, it is essentially just a mesh. Whoops. It's essentially just a mesh. So you can do with that what you would do with any other mesh object. So if you imported this or appended this into the custom pose file, you could create poses with the avatar draped over the... Let me just orientate this a bit so it's easier to... Oops. Which way around are we? 90. So if this was if you imported this into the avatar file, you could have the avatar draped over the fonts, and that would be your furniture item. So yes, once you've got the mesh, you can do with it as you would do with any other object. So you'd have to append. You either append this into the pose file or append the pose file contents into your project. You'd obviously have to scale this up to match the size of the IMVU avatars, but once you've got your mesh, that's it. You've got your the basics or the basis of an object that you can make. Just make sure that it has a material, texture, and an image. You'd have to make, before you export, you'll have to make this image real. So, UV editor. So once you've created your generated image, from the image menu in the UV image editor, you want save as image. And this will save it as a, well, let's just do it. Furniture. So we want text PNG, or, so you want a lossless format, bitmap, Targa raw, or TIFF. And then just save it. It'll convert what is essentially virtual generated data into real, relative to Blender at least anyway, which means that we now have an actual image assigned to the material. So when you export this, you won't get any errors. It'll not produce errors. If you export this with the generated temporary textures, it'll produce an error when you export. Or not when you export, when you import it into IMVU, because IMVU can't find anything. Yes, So Frenzy's asking, can we see the appending in the pose file? So you obviously have to save this. So save your project, save as text test 2. So we save that. We need to make a note of the object's name. So in this instance it's text.001, and that's in object properties. So keep that in mind. We then need to open the furniture file, which I shall drag and drop. Furniture file. Where's the furniture file gone? Can't find the furniture file. Oh, there it is. Right, so open the furniture file. So that's the seated dummy, the standing dummy, and the basic furniture block. So to append the object that we've just created, File, Append, and then we want to browse to the folder where we've just saved the file. Select it, text test 2, and this, when we append, the files essentially they behave like a zip file or an archive file. So when you select the file, you're actually going into and looking at the contents of the file, and you always want object. So click on the object folder, and there is our object. So left click select, select active layer, that's all right, and then click the append button. By default it has appended, but it's tiny, so that's just zooming in or using the view selected. The appended object comes in selected, auto selected, but it is absolutely tiny. So you'll need to rescale it to whatever size it is that you want. So press the S key to scale universally on all 3 axes. Press the S key and just move the mouse, and keep moving the mouse until you've got the text however big you want it to be. Or you can use the mouse, or so let me reset. Press the S key and then type a value, 500, and it'll do the same thing, but you have more control over that. And press enter to confirm, and that's your font loaded into the furniture template file. Why is it so tiny? Frenzy asks. Well, that's a long story, but the short answer is that it's not that the font's tiny, it's that IMVU's huge. IMVU's the original avatars were created using a very large scale, so I think it's meters. They used meters instead of centimeters, so it's something like 100 times larger than the default size or scaling that's used by Blender. So a 1 by 1 by 1 cube in Blender is tiny, but a 1 by 1 by 1 cube in IMVU is the equivalent of about 100 by 100 by 100 in Blender. So you do have to keep that in mind, obviously, when you are, if you are just creating something by just creating a new scene or file, You will at some point have to resize it relative to the avatars, so you're going to have to use the avatars at some point for scaling purposes. Even if you don't use them, you'll in terms of using them for the final items that you export to IMVU, even if you don't use them or include them with your object, you will need to use them to gauge the size of the thing that you're making. Yeah, meters, schmeters. But that's so you've got two things to keep in mind for IMVU if you are just using the default scene. It's the scale of the object, and which then means you have to import it into the furniture scene so that you can properly scale it. Any other questions? Any other text-related concerns? I have to wait for chat to catch up. Oh, so once you've created your furniture item, you then have to append that into the custom pose file if you were wanting to do custom poses. So you could use this, you could use a default furniture file to just create basic sitting and standing spots. But if you want custom spots, you have to create your furniture item as you would normally relative to IMVU, and then you have to import that or append that into the custom file so that you can then create custom poses for the object. Frenzy, so the max sizing an object in IMVU, not well. No, it doesn't work that way. It's just that the scale difference between Blender and IMVU is approximately 100 times bigger, smaller, depending on which way you're going. So as you saw with importing the Valentine text object, that was tiny, and it was scaled up 500 times to get it as big as it is. But if you were doing something that, I wonder if I can undo that. Yeah, so if I undo that and do scale, which is the S key, and then type 100, that is the object's actual size relative to IMVU. So if this were, let's say, a seat that you created from scratch using a default scene, when you append it to the furniture file, you would only need to scale it up by 100, which should in theory mean that it will sit, or it'll fit the seated avatar. So like the cube, if you worked on that from a blank scene, you'd have to scale that up 100 times for it to fit under the avatar's butt. Well, Frenzy just asking, can we just import into the post thingy as opposed to appending? Yes, well, it's generally it's recommended that you always start your projects from the post file. Not the post file, from the furniture default file, because that's obviously set up with all the basics that you need for furniture items. So you've got your root node, whoops, which I've just hidden. You've got your root node, which is attached to, or well, the cube is attached to the root node. But that's a basic furniture item. Those two items are what you need to get something to IMVU. The dummies, the seats, are optional. But if you use this file as the basis for your project, when you add an object to the scene, it'll be automatically scaled relative to these objects. So if I add a cube, mesh, cube, you can see that, well, let me just move it. You can see that it's actually scaled relative to the scene. Whereas if we added a cube to the original text scene, this cube would be tiny because it's relative to the text that we've added to the scene. So it's always best to start from the furniture templates or the starter files. Excuse me. But you do need to do certain degrees of appending depending on what it is that you're doing. So if you were making custom poses, you'd have to do the append, because you've got to get the furniture items set up. Let me just shift that out of the way. You've got to get your furniture items set up, and then the seating relative to your furniture item set up. So if I shift that there for now. So if that were your mesh, you have to create that first and then use the positions of these wireframe cubes as references for a custom pose that you might make. So you have to get your furniture item set up first, which is then appended into the custom pose file, which you can then create custom poses with. Yes, so if you so each of the objects that you see on screen is assigned to a different layer, and depending on what it is that you're working on, if you just want the basic furniture, you can select different layers and it'll show different elements of the furniture scene. But there's also, that's furniture based on the floor, furniture based for wall hanging, and then you've got ceiling furniture stuff. So everything's there that you need for the basic furniture items, but just left click the layer buttons and it'll show each of them relative to whatever it is that you're making. Well, if there aren't any other questions or comments, I think we can probably call it quits there, and hopefully we can start. Yes, Liana. Well, you might have an older version. If you've got an older version of the file, then the ceiling, floor, and wall setups won't be included, so you'll probably have to update. But if there are no other questions, I think we should probably call it quits there, and hopefully ShannonMac and Jinx will be here on Thursday. Offhanded question. What's your question, Francie? does Frenzy's asking, does a room kilobytes, that's the file size, have anything to do with someone? Yes. Yeah, so or is it PC or connection issues on there? Basically all three. So the time it takes, let's assume that you've got a decent internet connection. The time it takes for that room to load is dependent on the size, kilobytes wise, file size of the content that you're loading in. If it's derived from something, I can't remember off the top of my head if the room that the object is, the room that the room is derived from, whether that loads in as well. I can't remember if that actually does that. It's been a while since I don't think it does. But yes, file size does affect the speed and the time it takes for something to load. But also, yes, your PC's, your computer's specs, the processor, graphics card, memory, but more pertinently, your connection speed. So if you have, although you can't do this, I don't think mobile is quite there yet. So let's say, for the sake of argument, you could open and use the desktop client on your mobile phone or tablet. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that's true. If you were loading the same scene via wireless internet or LAN cable to your computer versus mobile, you might notice a difference in the time it takes for the same items to load because of the difference in connection speed. So all three do matter. But these days it's more likely going to be, if you get a slow loading item, it's going to be that the item itself is large file size wise. So hopefully that answers the question there. Frenzy's asking as well, is it better to use IMVU's cache cleaner or an outside one, or do it manually? Either or both, all work. I mean, at the end of the day, you're just clearing out the temporary files that have been stored in IMVU. But as far as I'm aware, the cache, the contents of the cache don't particularly affect the performance of IMVU. For a creator, you might want to clear out your temporary creator cache, which is in your My Documents folder, I think, if I remember off the top of my head. But you might want to clear that out, because every time you click derive from a product, it saves a version of the contents of that file locally. So if you, every time you start a project, for example, if you start a furniture project, every time you click the derive from the default chair, a version of that chair is, or a version of the file is saved to your folder. So if you do that a dozen times, you will have a dozen versions of that same file which you've not used. So you may periodically want to clear out your developer cache just to clear out those duplicates. But I don't think it affects the cache for the client as a general user. I don't think it necessarily creates any performance issues in terms of if you've got a lot of content in there, unless you've got so much content that it's slowing down the search and find of IMVU looking through your cache to pull up local copies of whatever it is that you're downloading, because it'll try that first and then download. But yes, with your developer cache, you'll want to clear that out periodically just to get rid of the duplicates. Alright, well, I guess we should call it quits there again, and for the second time. And hopefully, as I say, ShannonMac and Jinx will be here to go through basically what we've just been going through is what I understand ShannonMac will be doing. So we shall see you all on Thursday. So thanks for stopping by for this preview. I guess you could call it that. Well, until Thursday.